Hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar, 3 Steps to Integrate Regulatory Change Management into Operations. I'm Lois Engström, the Marketing Manager here at CloseMatch, and today I'm joined by my colleague David Noble and GRC pundit Michael Rasmussen. I assume most of you know about Michael, but for those of you who don't, Michael is an internationally recognized pundit on governance, risk management and compliance. Michael helps organizations improve GRC processes, design and implement GRC architectures, and select solutions that are effective, efficient, and agile. He is a sought-after keynote speaker, author, and advisor, and is noted as the father of GRC, being the first to define and model the GRC market in February 2002 whilst at Forrester Research. Today, we are going to explore the 3 steps to integrate regulatory change management into operation. How to monitor regulatory change and its impact on your specific business context. How to manage policies to keep them current with the regulatory change in context of operations. And how to communicate policies to ensure the first line of defense in business operations knows what is expected of them. So with no further ado, I'm just going to hand it over to you, Michael.
Today we're going to talk about 3 steps to integrate regulatory change management into operations. Now, my whole point of view and premise here is that there's a lot of investment in time and money being spent on regulatory change management. There's lots and lots of changing regulations, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But having great regulatory change management processes that are just make you intelligent about the law and the change are not enough. It has to go down into operations. How do we operationalize regulatory change management? So in that context today, I'll do an introduction to the challenge of regulatory change management, then introduce 3 steps to integrate regulatory change management into operations. Those 3 steps are the ability to monitor regulatory change, manage the regulatory change as it impacts policies, and then communicate those changes in the business. All those are very relevant. What I find frustrating in some organizations is that they sort of they start and stop with that point number 1 and just trying to monitor the change instead of operationalizing the organization. And to really be compliant, you've got to be able to take it all the way through to operationalization. And from that standpoint, have some type of integrated technology architecture that can deliver on all 3 of those elements of monitor, manage, and communicate. But let's get into this. Next slide, please. So the organization today needs to be able to see the tree as well as the forest. There's that individual regulatory obligation, whether it's a market conduct, anti-money laundering, privacy, something related to GDPR, whatever it might be. There's that individual regulation. And the truth is there's lots of those trees. It's a huge forest out there of thousands and thousands and thousands of laws and regulations and requirements. But you also have to see the forest, the interconnectedness of regulations and policies. You might be following that market conduct or anti-money laundering regulation in one jurisdiction, like in the United Kingdom or in the United States. But there's other laws and regulations of a similar topic around money laundering around the world, whether it's Singapore or Australia or Japan. And so there's the interconnectedness of regulations. And we need to understand, what are the nuances? How do we go about addressing money laundering, market conduct, again, whatever your topic is that you're focusing on, but understand our jurisdictional breadth as we have operations around the world, and what are the common elements of this type of regulation, but what are the nuances and differences, and how can we address policy and processes and operationalization of this to meet all of the requirements, preferably, around the world on a topic. But if not, 80% of them, and understand there's going to be some nuances in some parts of the world where policies might be different, which means that we need to see that individual regulation, but the interconnectedness of regulations, but also how they connect to policies. So when that regulation changes, what policies need to be revised? What needs to be reviewed there? So today's organization needs to be able to see the tree as well as the forest. Next slide, please. So we need to keep a lot of things in context when looking at change and compliance management. We have to look at the volume of legal and regulatory change. But that's not enough. I mean, and in just that area, there's lots of legal and regulatory change. I mean, we got changing laws, rules, regulations, but enforcement actions. The law itself or the regulation itself might not have changed, but how it's been enforced and understood by the regulators, that might be changing. We have to keep up with all of that. But then we also have to keep up with change in our external risk environment, changing market forces, like economic forces that impact our credit risk policies, geopolitical forces, and shifts in technology and society and industry trends and things like that. All that needs to come into balance with the regulatory change as we operationalize it. And then we have to understand our changing internal business itself, changing strategy, which is shifting quite a bit right now with the current crisis. Processes are changing as we move things to work from home. And how does that impact regulations, and what regulations are being temporarily changed to deal with this crisis, but will come back to normal regulation over a period of time, then what regulations will be more permanent and ongoing. We have to understand the impact on temporary as well as long-term business processes, the impact on technology and employees. The employees themselves, if they're not aware of the regulatory change, it doesn't matter how intelligent we are about the law and regulation in the back office of compliance. If the line of business doesn't understand that change, and is playing by the old rule book and how business used to be conducted, we're not compliant anymore. That regulatory change needs to filter down to the frontline employees. And then how does the regulatory change impact our third-party relationships, particularly when they're interacting with a lot of our internal business processes? And then how do we deal with mergers and acquisitions that add to regulatory change as we take on new product lines and new jurisdictions and themes through growth? We have to keep all of this change in sync as we try to operationalize and manage change in our environment. Next slide, please. But global financial services firms are dealing with a lot, and we can talk about this across a range of industries, whether it's energy or healthcare or life sciences. But here's a snapshot just from financial services. Global financial services firms on average are dealing with 220 regulatory change events every business day. From new laws and regulations, change laws and regulations, notices of proposed rulemaking, enforcement actions, everything else. There's 220 regulatory change events coming from over 980 regulators around the world every business day. Now, every one time there's a regulatory change doesn't mean that our processes and our policies might need to change, but at least it brings in that question that we need to evaluate that. Hopefully our policies and our processes are resilient to a lot of regulatory change, and not a lot of modification has to happen as we hit 220 regulatory change events every business day. But there are some of those events that do require significant change, requires agile approaches to be able to manage that in our environment. Next slide, please. So the current pressures to be able to manage regulatory change, are legion. There's the frequency of change, just like the previous slide. 220 regulatory change events every business day in financial services alone. You have the global context of trying to manage change in different jurisdictions. And how do we address something like money laundering or market conduct or privacy and deal with the regulations in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, and France, and Singapore, and Japan, Hong Kong, wherever it might be? How do we address a global context of regulatory change and try to write our policies and define our processes consistently across the organization to be able to meet their different requirements in different jurisdictions while still trying to maintain as much consistency as possible? We have the expansion into new markets and new products and service lines that introduce new areas of regulatory change. We have evolving risks. The current crisis and pandemic is before us. We have new risks, and how do we deal with stay-at-home workers? How do we deal with privacy and market conduct in the context of stay-at-home workers? How do we deal with, the ability to record, phone calls and stuff with investment and brokerage firms that are often required by law with the stay-at-home workers? How do we record those communications now? How do we deal with the evolving risk environment? Then you got the challenge of dealing with hordes of regulatory information. It's unfortunate, and I've been advocating for years that we need a standardized XML format for regulators to publish regulations in. But that's not the case. There are some regulators, like the Financial Conduct Authority in the United Kingdom, that are leading the world in digitizing the FCA rulebook, but that's not what's common around the world right now. And there's different approaches to publishing And we've got all these different regulators that might be publishing things in PDF and print format, and might have RSS feeds and other formats. And then you got the regulatory aggregators out there that are trying to aggregate all this information. And you're dealing with 220 regulatory change events every business day. And even in areas of where there is strong digitization of the laws and regulations, like with the Financial Conduct Authority in the United Kingdom, you print off the rule book from the FCA, and it comes to a book that's 6 feet tall, where you have hordes of regulatory information. And how do we shift through that? And trying to do that with people requires an army of compliance and legal professionals to be able to manage and monitor all that, when at the same time the organization is trying to cut costs and streamline business. That's challenging. And you have the need for defensible compliance, to be able to show and demonstrate that you are compliant to the regulation at any moment in time. These are the pressures on regulatory change today. Next slide, please. Now, the way a lot of organizations are approaching regulatory change in their environments is what I call the inevitability of failure. Too many documents and manual approaches that slow the organization down. Think about that. You're getting 220 regulatory change events coming in from around the world if you're in financial services. How do we filter through those and be able to manage and monitor that and identify what policies and processes need to change as a result of those changes, and which do not, which ones are current to those change? If you're dealing that with a lot of documents, spreadsheets, and emails, emails get sent, they get ignored, they get filed away, they're slow to respond to, there's really no escalation in things, and trying to have a defensible trail of compliance and showing how you're keeping up with regulatory change is just a disaster, because there's no audit trail or system of record or accountability in documents, spreadsheets, and emails, and things slip through the cracks. It takes like 200 hours to build a report. And at that point, we're not managing compliance, we're reacting to events and issues. That's the inevitability of failure. We need strong processes automated by technology with artificial intelligence to be able to manage regulatory change in the volume and pace of business today. In the next slide, the physicist Fritjof Capra said, "The more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are interconnected and interdependent." This is important to understand as we look at regulatory change in our environment, that we need to be able to understand the interconnectedness and interdependencies of regulations around the world, and how they impact our organization, our policies, our processes, and our operations. Just as in the graphic before you, you've got streams of thread coming in, and there could be a money laundering regulation from Singapore, another one from Australia, another one from South Africa, another one from the United Kingdom, and there's similarities, but there's nuances and differences. How do we understand the interconnectedness, interdependency, but then how do we understand how they impact our processes and our policies? Because it's all interconnectedness. The physicist Fritjof Capra here is talking about biological ecosystems. But what he's talking about in this quote so specifically can apply so well today to modern business and dealing with regulatory change, particularly in financial services firms. Again, the more we study the major problems of our time, whether those problems are anti-money laundering, market conduct, privacy, or many other areas, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they're interconnected and interdependent. They impact our organization, our policies, our processes. We need to see that full context. Back to that first slide that I talked about, the tree and the forest. We have to see these interconnections. Next slide, please. So it means that the organization needs to start collaborating on compliance strategy, process, and technology globally. To be able to, instead of having different functions and departments going in different directions with different streams and feeds of regulatory intelligence and news and everything, to be able to provide a harmonized and consistent collaborative process on compliance strategy, process, and technology. That's what we need to aim for today, and that's what makes successful business in a time of chaos and a time of a lot of change in the organization. We need to have strong collaboration, which means a top-down strategy on regulatory change and compliance that has defined processes to be able to monitor regulatory change and its impact on business process and strategy and policies and controls in the environment, is supported by a strong information technology architecture. That gets to the heart of the presentation today in the next slide. So let's discuss 3 steps to integrate regulatory change into operations in your organization. The first one is monitoring the change. Then we'll talk about managing the change as it impacts policies and processes. And 3, we'll communicate that change. But first, we need to be able to monitor the change. Before we can even manage or communicate it, we need to understand what's changed out there. Next slide, please. So that means understanding the range of different regulatory intelligence content types, from laws and regulations, enforcement actions, public notices, committee activity and meetings, speeches and announcements, or, regulatory guidance and interpretation, and special rules and everything else out there. We need to be able to take in and understand the different types of regulatory content and the different types of jurisdictions that we're operating in around the world. Next slide, please. This means that we need to build out some type of regulatory taxonomy, that we understand the different types of content feeds and intelligence and information that comes in, but be able to map that into an organizational structure. How do we classify, whether it's some type of Dewey Decimal System, card catalog type system, that we can classify different types of regulations and its impact on policies and processes. What is our regulatory taxonomy? And what's the regulatory content that can feed into that taxonomy to fill out that taxonomy in its various parts? And how do we enable this with technology and artificial intelligence? So it starts off with developing that regulatory taxonomy and metadata, mapping subject matter experts and roles and responsibilities to that taxonomy, so we know who that subject matter expert is in that particular area of regulation as well as jurisdiction. Integration of regulatory content with technology, mapping regulations and hopefully leveraging artificial intelligence to map regulations to policies. Providing structured accountability with workflow, tasks, audit trail, and automation. And be able to conduct regulatory business impact and risk analysis to understand the change and its impact on the organization. Next slide, please. This means that we need to be able to filter changes to identify synergies and the change needed. We need to take in a volume of information from different regulatory sources and regulatory aggregators and different areas of the world, and be able to understand and determine relationships and synergies and identify the changes to compliance that impact our policies, our processes, the operations of the business, the controls within the business. We need to be able to take in, those 220 regulatory change events every business day in that stage 1, understand that, 4 or 5 of these 220 regulatory change events are addressing a very consistent area and are of a significant area that identify which policies and process needs to change to address that. So taking a lot of stuff coming into the organization, filtering it down to what are the actionable things that we need to take action on. Next slide, please. So here's one example of a regulatory change process. We need to be able to take in the different types of regulatory content sourcing, whether they're coming directly from the regulators or some type of aggregator or out there that's aggregating information, including things like new laws and regulations, amended, changed regulations, guidance by the regulators, news and circulators from the regulators and other legal advice, comment letters, enforcement actions. To me, that's a critical one, because a lot of times the law or regulation hasn't changed. It's been the same, but the way it's being enforced has changed. You take something like bribery and corruption. And here in the United States, where I live, we've had the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act since 1977. And so that's 43 years. And you look at FCPA, there's 2 main sections to it. There's the thou shalt not bribe section, so don't do bribes. And then there's the books and records internal control section, and how the accounting and things needs to be done. And that, I don't want to get all the details because we can spend a whole other webinar on that. But you have these 2 main sections to the regulation. Well, the enforcement actions for the first few decades all focused on the you will not bribe people section. But over the last 15 years, we've seen a significant change in the enforcement actions to focus on the books and records and internal control provisions of the FCPA. It's been in the law the whole time since 1977, but enforcement focused on just on a piece of it. And now over the last 15 years, enforcement expanded to the other parts of the regulation that were there the whole time. Enforcement also changes what industries and companies are concerned. It used to be that something like FCPA, people were only concerned about, if they were in like oil and life sciences and manufacturing. large financial services firms really weren't concerned about it. Then 20 years ago, they started to be looked at by the Department of Justice and the SEC, because enforcement started to focus on financial services firms. When in the first few decades, there was very little monitoring of financial services firms in context of FCPA. Enforcement changed. It used to be that if you're a small to mid-sized firm, that you weren't concerned about it, because the Department of Justice and SEC, they're going to go out to the large firms. Then all of a sudden came along the cases of, Avon and Smith & Wesson, and you have the statement from the SEC out there and Department of Justice saying, we don't care what size you are, if you have bribery and corruption happening, we're coming after you. Enforcement actions are important to monitor as well, not just the law and regulation itself, but how it's being enforced. And then you have things like feedback statements and speeches. All this comes into our regulatory change management process and system, hopefully where things can be auto-assigned through artificial intelligence and with proper subject matter expert review and approval of what's changed and the analysis of that. And then move into impact assessments and understanding how this change impacts our policies and our processes, and building out an action plan on what to do with that change in the environment. Let's look at a similar process, but in a little more of a flow chart and storyboard format in the next slide, please. So here we have one of the OSEG GRC illustrations that we did. I'm an OSEG fellow and do a lot of work with OSEG on the regulatory change management process. And in this context, it starts to identify and define. And anybody on the phone here can go out to oseg.org and be able to download the regulatory change and other illustrations. Like we have several on policy management as well that intersect with this. So we need to be able to identify and define. We develop the company profile. We apply and develop that regulatory content taxonomy, and establish, the risk-based regulatory library with the proper links there. In that context, after we identify and define, we track and analyze. What are the different types of regulations that we track and manage and monitor in that process? So we track and analyze the relevant regulatory actions. We compare and analyze them from what they currently are to what they were in the past, and we maintain that regulatory library that we built in step 1. Step 3, we monitor and map. We map regulatory events to the effective areas of the business, like business processes and policies. We evaluate need for control, actions and changes, and we notify control and policy owners of changes to the regulations so that they can look at and review the policy to determine what's changed. From there, we move into step 4, where we control and manage. We evaluate flag impacts on controls, actions, and operations. We determine changes and implement and record those changes in the environment. And we identify exceptions and exemptions and record reasoning and other alternatives to the regulatory change that we need to evaluate. And this is a circular process. But throughout all this, we also need to be able to report and record. We need to continually monitor and analyze the environment, report key changes and business impacts, and maintain audit trails of compliance in the organization. Next slide, please. Let's look at some key success factors on monitoring the regulatory change in our environment. Some regulatory change management critical success factors is the ability to, first off, provide that regulatory content taxonomy organized by geography, sector, content, and defined themes. You have just in financial services, and I understand that there's some on the phone that come from other industries as well. But in the context of financial services, we have over 980 regulators around the world. Now, which of those 980 regulators apply to your business? By geography, by sector, by content type, and themes of the regulator? How do we map those in there? Some of you might just have 1 or 2, maybe 5 of those regulators you're concerned about because you're just a small domestic organization without international relationships. Others, large global banks have to pretty much address, hundreds of regulators around the world. Then we map the regulatory content taxonomy to internal taxonomies for organizational structure, products, policies, and controls. We provide real-time tracking of thousands of varied sources and types of content. We provide flagging of proposed and final regulatory changes so that we know what needs to be looked at more critically, what's high risk. We have risk profiling of the organization, expert analysis for impact based on company profile, automatic notification to effective policy and control owners and business process owners so that they can apply that regulatory change in the context of revised policies and updated business processes. tracking and responding those changes where there's full accountability with workflow and tasks and escalation procedures, a thorough audit trail to document what happened throughout all this whole process and what actions were taken, with strong reporting. So we need to be able to identify the different content sourcing changes on regulatory change, develop that regulatory obligation library that establishes categories, assign the subject matter experts to each area of those categories. You need to be able to map risks, policies, and processes, assessments, and other GRC areas to the taxonomy so that when there is a change, the subject matter expert knows what to evaluate to determine if it's still current and consistent with the change. You need to leverage and use technology to route changes to the subject matter expert and track accountability and follow through. And this is an area where artificial intelligence can enhance this in the environment. From there, we implement a standard business impact analysis methodology to determine the change and its impact on the organization and rank it as far as some type of risk scale. And we integrate the change monitoring process and technology with policy management technology so that those policies can be kept consistent in the environment. And that last point brings us to the next slide as we move to step 2 in the 3 steps to integrate regulatory change management and operations. So in the first step, we monitored the change and identified what's changed in the environment. 2, we need to take action on it. We need to be able to update those policies in the environment to make sure that they're current, as well as the processes. Next slide, please. So as we're monitoring for regulatory change in the environment, there's a lot of other change that impacts policies as well, like changing industry practices, geopolitical risks out there, societal and environmental standards, shifts in technology, market demands, as well as the internal context of changes in our risk tolerance and and this could again impact from the external perspective. So you might have a changing economic condition, which means that our risk tolerance and what we would accept as in our credit risk policy might change. It shifts in our strategic and operating plans, our culture of the organization. And so when we're monitoring for regulatory change, it's important to understand that there's a lot of other changes that happen in the environment too. And so we go to modify a policy that's been flagged because of regulatory change. It's time to have contextual understanding and awareness of other changes that can impact that policy. Because we can only modify policies so many times. We can't be modifying policies every week or every month of the year because the employees are going to scream at us. You just sent out the money laundering policy 2 weeks ago. You're telling me that it's changed again and it's changing again in 2 weeks from now? The environment can't support that. So when we're monitoring for regulatory change and it flags that there's a policy that needs to be revised, we should look at other areas of context that might impact that policy too, so that we can address all the changes coming down on that policy or that type of policy and address it once instead of changing it again and again and again. So monitoring for regulatory change is the piece of other monitoring that has to happen as it impacts that policy. Next slide, please. From there, we take in distributed and disconnected compliance data points, understand these and map them together to provide context of what's changed. So those distributed and disconnected compliance data points might be a regulatory feed coming from a regulator in Singapore, another one in the United Kingdom, another one in Germany, another one in Australia. But then another distributed and disconnected compliance data point might be your investigations. We've been having a lot of violations on this policy because of ambiguity in that policy. People are saying they don't understand it. There might be a lot of different disconnected compliance data points that filter into our policy management system. We integrate and understand these and analyze which ones impact this specific policy we're working on right now, and what are the action items to enhance and revise this policy to address the regulatory requirement, the increase in incidents and cases, investigations, the lack of awareness, whatever it might be. Because there might be multiple things that are coming in and feeding that this policy needs to be changed. Regulatory change is just one of those elements, a critical one, and probably the driver of the change itself. But if we're going to update that policy, we should look at the other areas of data that are coming in that might help us improve that policy. Because if we're getting a lot of complaints that policy is ambiguous and hard to read, well, just changing some language to address the regulatory requirement is not going to solve all of our problems. We need to address everything we understand about that policy, the regulatory change that's requiring us to change that policy, But if there's a lot of complaints of saying that the policy is ambiguous and hard to read, well, we should address some of the clarity of the language so that it's properly understood since we're revising that policy anyways. Taking all these different things and building in those action items. Next slide, please. But we also need to make sure that our policies are kept current, not just with the laws and regulations, but with the mission, vision, values, and culture of the organization and the ability to execute on strategy. The proper definition of governance, risk management, and compliance, as found in the OSEG GRC capability model, is that GRC is a capability to reliably achieve objectives while addressing uncertainty and active integrity. When we're dealing with regulatory change, we're focused a lot on the uncertainty and the risk management piece, as well as active integrity, the compliance piece. But policies are also there to help us reliably achieve objectives, the strategy, the processes, the mission, vision, and values of the organization. So we go to revise those policies. We're not just trying to revise them just to meet the regulatory requirements, but help operationalize and enable the organization to reliably achieve the objectives of the organization while addressing the risk and uncertainty and meet the regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. So this moves into the overall policy authoring and approval, where organizations should have some established policy on writing policies. And I just talked about this last week with the webinar with Clause Match as well. We have a whole webinar on that. And I encourage you to look at that. But it sets out, who can author and revise a policy, who's responsible for it, and the proper templates involved as well. But we need to be able to draft that policy to meet the new regulatory changes and requirements of the organization, get feedback on it and edit it and collaborate on it and bring it to final approval in the organization. Organizations should have some strong, defined policy authoring and approval process to make sure policies are consistently managed, are done in the same language and templates of the organization, and that they're properly reviewed and approved in the organization as well, and indexed. All that's important so that we can keep policies consistent with regulatory change. This is all part of a broader policy management lifecycle process that we look at in the next slide. And so in that context, we need to be able to manage the policies through the step one, determining the need. And that's what we looked at in the first of the 3 steps to operationalize regulatory change, is identifying that a change has happened in a regulation that impacts a policy. It then moves into that develop and approve, where we author the new or revised policy to address the regulatory change requirements, and we get approval. In the next section, in just a minute, we're going to look at the communicate and train. But from there, we need to be able to monitor and enforce the policy and document violations and exceptions and measure and maintain that policy on an ongoing and continuous basis. That's the effective policy management lifecycle, all part of managing policies. So let's move into the next slide. So we looked at, first off, in the 3 steps to integrate regulatory change management into operations, be able to monitor regulatory change. Then we looked at step 2, be able to manage the policies to be current with that regulatory change. Step 3 is communicating that. If there's been a change to a policy, just updating the policy or writing new policy is not enough. You might have all the right policies and they're worded perfectly. They're beautifully well-written policies and you're proud of the language you use and you're addressing all those new regulatory requirements and they're put on some digital shelf and nobody's aware of it. Well, you're not compliant then. Having great policies does not make you compliant, even if they're consistent with regulatory change. It has to be operationalized and communicated to the business. So we need to be able to communicate those revised policies from those regulatory changes in the environment. That's step 3. We monitored the change, we managed and updated the policies, and then we need to communicate that. So next slide, please. So here we need to build out a policy implementation and communication plan. We need to understand how are we going to implement this policy in the environment? Who are the key stakeholders? What processes are going to be impacted? Who do we need to get involved in the implementation plan of this policy? From there, once we understand the broader implementation plan on the controls related to the policy, how the policy is going to be measured, monitored, and maintained, we then move into the communication plan. How do we communicate and make people aware of the policy? Do we have different types of audiences and roles? What type do we need to have training on this policy as a result of the regulatory change? And so what's the training plan? So the communication and the training plan, what's the implementation timeline? Is this going into effect this month, next month? Is it staged? Will things happen over a period of time? What's the implementation timeline from the communication and training plan? Do we have certain activities going out at certain timeframes to remind people the revised policies? And getting the proper approvals and different consideration checklists out there so everybody's aware of their responsibilities and actions that need to happen. Next slide, please. As part of the overall policy and compliance communication plan, we need to understand what are our communication goals? What are we trying to achieve here with this revised policy to meet that updated and changed regulatory requirement? Who's our audience? Is it everybody in the organization, like which would impact like a corporate code of conduct type thing? Or is it a specific segment of the organization, such as risk management or lending or credit, whoever it might be? Who's our audience for this particular policy with this regulatory change? Are there different types of audiences that are high risk, medium, low risk? What resources need to be available? And how do we make it accessible? Are we communicating the policy and delivering the training in different languages and different formats? How do we measure the effectiveness and align and get internal stakeholders involved in the program as well? Next slide, please. From there, we need to be able to, again, as I was just stating, understand our audiences. You might have something like a privacy policy, like with GDPR and California CCPA and others. And you've got certain individuals that are high relevance roles because they're interacting with personally identifiable information day in and day out and have regular access to it. You have others that have more moderate access to it or medium risk roles, and some people in your organization that are low risk roles because they don't really interact with much personal information, but it still occasionally comes up. And maybe some people that it doesn't even apply to their job because they don't have access to that type of information. And how we communicate policies and deliver training to deal with that regulatory area that's changed and evolved, might be different. Even though the policy is the same, we might have deeper actions and training that happens to high relevance roles over low relevance roles. So next slide, please. We move into that communication plan and we take action upon that. And taking action upon that, there's areas where we might just need to distribute and make people aware. There's a revised policy to deal with this new regulatory requirement. And so we send out an email or some type of notification that there's an updated policy here. You need to be aware of that. This is happening a lot right now with the work from home. But some areas we want to get stronger acknowledgement where it's not, we just don't want to make people aware of it. We want to distribute the policy to deal with the new regulatory change and get some type of acknowledgement, some certification, read and understood, electronic signature that says, yes, I did read this, maybe even answer some questions. And then for some of those high risk roles, again, we not only distribute and ask for certification or acknowledgement, but we're also providing training on the policy as well. And again, one policy, we might have all three of these branches because low risk roles, we might just need to make people aware of it. Medium risk roles around that policy, we want acknowledgement. While high risk roles, we want acknowledgement, but we also want some type of training on it as well. Next slide, please. Now, policies in a regulatory context needs to be accessible. And so we need policy push and policy pull. And so when the employee out there, particularly in this remote office worker environment, dealing with the current crisis that we're in right now, where they're trying to find out, what is the current policy to govern this situation now with this changed environment that I'm in, they need to be able to go out there and find that policy in that portal and get their question answered. Policy push is where we would just revise that policy and we're going to communicate and make sure everybody's aware of it. So the policy pull is where that employee is looking for the answer because they have a question. The policy push is where we just updated, changed, or we need to make people aware of it. So we're pushing it out to employees. Next slide, please. This all requires that we have a strong policy portal to communicate regulatory changes to our employees. A portal that is good and highly intuitive, adaptive, personal, and accessible from the desktop to the laptop to the tablet to the mobile device, where people can get their questions answered on policies and regulations anytime, any place, wherever they're at, whether they're at one of the few that remain in an office today, or whether they're some of the many that are working from home office and need to find those policies related to regulations. I was interacting with one financial services firms recently that's finding that their policies are a mess as they try to manage all this change in the current crisis. They found that they had policies on 20 different portals across the organization, and policies are being updated and revised on these portals to deal with updated regulations and change expectations and things in the context of the crisis. And employees are scratching their heads because they've got to go to all these different portals and they're trying to find these policies, and they're realizing that they need a singular view into all policies and a singular company policy portal that brings in all these policies from different departments consistently in the organization to communicate in a time of crisis. So next slide, please. In conclusion, we looked at 3 steps to integrate regulatory change management into operations: monitoring regulatory change, managing that change as it impacts policy and processes, and 3, communicating those changes to the employees themselves. Next slide. All this delivers what I call agile compliance, where we're aware of what's changing in our environment from the regulations. We're aligned because we have the proper taxonomy and technology and process in place, so that when there is a change we become aware of, we aligned and we know what policies and processes to review. This makes us more responsive, where our environment is current. Instead of taking months to get current on that regulatory change and bringing in exposure for noncompliance, we can be more agile in the environment and responsive to address that change, which makes us more resilient, particularly in a time of crisis, and efficient in our use of resources. So with that, I'd like to turn this back over to our host, ClausMatch, to understand how they're approaching this from a technology point of view.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Just checking, Lois, that you can hear me okay.
Yes, all good, David.
Perfect, excellent. Yes, Michael, thanks very much for that. As always, really insightful, particularly in terms of how we communicate those policy changes to the business. As you said, we've talked about that on previous webinars, and certainly about how we can better implement and these sorts of things. Obviously, clear communication is paramount. We don't want to be working against the business. Everything should be clear, concise, and if possible, straightforward as well. Earlier this year, I was in a meeting, obviously prior to the lockdown at the moment, but I was in a meeting with a large financial institution in Canary Wharf, and we were there to find out a few things about how they manage updates to policies and procedures, obviously in line with regulatory changes. What they walked us through was fairly typical for most firms. Lots of people, some offshore in this case, lots of databases, spreadsheets, lots of email and telephone work. In one example, a compliance officer explained that she'd actually spent 8 weeks talking to 50 people to review a single policy. So 8 weeks, 50 people, and that's just for one single policy update. Basically, her time was being wasted because of the processes that they had in place. They were quite inefficient, and there was a real lack of traceability between their group policies, their local policies, procedures, and ultimately going back to the bank's regulatory obligations and those underlying regulations themselves. So, as we all know, the volume of regulations, and as Michael showed in his slides there, the volume of regulations, of legislative changes, updates coming from industry bodies keep increasing, and there doesn't really seem to be much we can do to prevent that. So compliance really starts to feel like a bit of a heavy burden on all of us, and wherever we are in the firm, really. But a lot of that burden is because, in most cases, the effort required to understand how the organisation is affected by these changes is usually based on manual, highly inefficient, and sometimes error-prone processes. Think of the regulatory change process slide that Michael showed us. These are multiple, overlapping, laborious processes that have been built up over time. There's lots of, we look at lots of firms who capture updates from regulatory websites, or they subscribe to third parties who update them via feeds and portals. In these cases, you'll have people or teams even that take this information and they put it into spreadsheets, these massive spreadsheets. With sometimes as many columns as there are rows. But you hear about people then triaging this information, throwing teams of people at it. They slice and dice their way through it, and they start to assign these out to other people in the business who then need to figure out the consequences of the change on their area of the business. Then there's committees and groups that are set up to interpret the firm's obligations. They then design procedures and controls around this new information. So the time and effort involved is immense, and the teams required to manage this end-to-end obviously are expanding in order to support these manual processes. Lois, should we just flick to the next slide? So we all know that managing regulations is hard work, it's time consuming, it's expensive. Regulatory failures obviously lead to fines. Everyone's familiar now with the phrase, if you think compliance is expensive, try non-compliance. Maybe wearing a little thin now. Where we're at now is a point in time where there are ample tools and solutions that are in the marketplace that do enable firms to get a much better grip, operationally on regulatory change management, or RCM. The process of developing dynamic relationships between regulation and internal policies, procedures and controls can be largely automated now. So enabling compliance teams to see the potential impacts of upcoming changes to regulation, much as to what Michael's showing us in his presentation. So really no one should be managing this in spreadsheets or some single huge spreadsheet. They should be chasing people up on email to provide impact assessment feedback. We should have a much better overview and insight into how these external regulatory changes are affecting very specific activities around the organisation. Earlier in this webinar series, Michael was quite emphatic about the policies and rather policy management, and it's sitting very much at the heart of successful governance, risk and compliance programs, that it's really paramount to ensuring that policies are clearly devised and well communicated to employees, and really sitting there as the basis of good and effective governance. We're working with the business, ensuring clarity of purpose and communication is key for successful policy management. Well, the same is true for regulatory change management. The policies, as Michael told us, ultimately define how the business acts in the end. These are devised to reflect external expectations from those regulators, legislators and other industry bodies. So the relationship between these regulations, the organisation's regulatory obligations and its internal policies and procedures should be clearly understood so that we can see how any proposed changes to the underlying regulations will impact us. We can then prepare the business for these changes, ensure that we have adequate procedures and controls in place. We don't need to do this in a spreadsheet. We shouldn't be spending 8 weeks and making 50 calls to update a policy. So solutions like clause match are here to specifically reduce the burden of managing the effects of regulatory change on the policies, procedures and controls that govern the business. With machine learning technologies, we can manage the relationships between regulations, obligations, policies, procedures, controls, etc. Changes that impact these relationships can be automatically flagged and routed to those that are responsible for managing the impact of these changes and for implementing these changes. Obviously, it's not a magic bullet. It doesn't remove the burden of compliance internally, but it does enable risk and compliance teams to focus on high value tasks for them to be more effective and to work with the business. Everyone's talked about this for years, certainly since the financial crash in 2008. And the reality is that back then the technology wasn't quite right. It was expensive. It required a lot of resources to implement and maintain, but that's just not the case anymore. So the technology is here. Implementations can be a lot simpler. The payoff is quite fast. The benefits of automating manual compliance processes can be quickly felt. Lois, just the last slide now, thanks. So we've actually worked with some of our customers in order to establish the extent to which our solutions increase the efficiency and effectiveness of moving away from manual legacy processes towards automation. And the results have been really good. So reduction of duplicated policies, for example. In fact, on last week's webinar, one of my colleagues talked about a bank that was sending out duplicate, contradictory policies to staff. I think it's one coming from HR, another one coming from compliance, causing lots of confusion, and obviously not to mention the waste of effort that went into producing those updated policies in the first place. We've also seen policy refresh times reduced by months. and the overall cost of policy management reduced quite significantly as well. So the questions now really are, how long do you spend on your policy refresh? What effort goes into updating and communicating policy change to the wider workforce? How do you identify regulatory impacts on those policies? Are you relying on people and spreadsheets to map your regulatory obligations to your policies and controls? How do you assess the impact of regulatory change on specific activities around the world? Are you making 50 calls to find out? Do you need 8 weeks before you can set up, or rather before you can communicate out to senior management on their responsibilities and how they're impacted? Okay, well, I think I'm starting to run out of time now, but there's obviously a lot we can talk about this. There's also a lot that Clause Match can help with in terms of using automated technologies to reduce the time and effort that's spent on regulatory change management and policy management. So please do feel free to get in touch with us. Information is provided in this webinar, or you can go to our website and you can reach out to us there. Thank you very much for listening. Lois, back over to you.
Excellent. Michael, David, thank you so much for sharing your insights and knowledge with us today. For those of you who have been listening, I hope you enjoyed this webinar. It is a part of the webinar series Compliance in Challenging Times, and this was the last one that we will be running this month. You will receive an email later with a link to the recording of this webinar, and you will also receive the PDF of the presentation slides. Should you have any questions, please do reply to that email and we will come back to you as soon as possible. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you all will join us again next Tuesday.